The gunman kicked in the emergency room doors at 2:14 in the morning, and the first person they grabbed by the collar was the one nobody in that hospital had ever bothered to notice. She did not scream. She did not flinch. She simply looked into the barrel pressed against her ribs and asked, in a voice so calm it made the masked man's hand tremble, whether he really wanted to find out what happened next. If you believe in second chances, in the quiet people who carry more strength than anyone realizes, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope tonight, and subscribe to Midnight Tale so you never miss a story that reminds you why we keep believing in people. Now let's go back to where it all began. Her name was Elena Cross, and for 11 months she had been the nurse nobody talked to at Riverside Memorial. She ate lunch alone in the break room, her eyes fixed on nothing, her answers to small talk clipped and brief. The other nurses whispered that she was strange, maybe even a little broken. Dr. Whitfield, the senior attending physician, made a habit of correcting her in front of patients, as though her competence were something to be doubted rather than trusted. Nobody knew that Elena had spent 6 years as a combat medic before she ever touched a hospital badge, that she had knelt in dust and blood in places whose names never made the evening news, and that the silence people mistook for weakness was the same silence she used to steady her hands while the world exploded around her. She had left the service after her third deployment, not because she wanted to, but because grief had followed her home and would not let go. Her best friend, a young corporal named Danny Ruiz, had died in her arms during an ambush that should never have happened, and Elena had promised him, in the last minutes she had with him, that she would spend the rest of her life saving people instead of counting the ones she couldn't. So she became a nurse. She buried her rank, her medals, and her past in a drawer she never opened, and she let people believe whatever they wanted about the quiet woman in blue scrubs who flinched at loud noises and never smiled for photographs. The mockery was small at first, the kind that hides behind laughter. Nurses rolled their eyes when she double-checked every medication 3 times. They called her robotic behind her back. When a new resident once asked why she stood so straight, spine like a rifle, feet always shoulder-width apart even at the nurse's station, someone joked that she probably used to be a soldier girl playing dress-up. Elena said nothing. She had learned long ago that explaining herself to people who had already decided who she was would only waste breath she needed for people who actually required saving. Then came the night that changed everything. 2 men in tactical vests and ski masks stormed the emergency room just after 2 in the morning, dragging a wounded accomplice between them, screaming for a doctor to save him or everyone in the room would pay for it. Patients dropped to the floor. A young mother wrapped herself around her toddler in the corner. Dr. Whitfield backed against the wall, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't even reach for his phone. The armed men shouted orders that nobody understood, and for a few unbearable seconds, the entire emergency department seemed to hold its breath in unison, waiting for someone, anyone, to do something. Elena stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She walked toward the wounded man with the same unhurried steadiness she used when checking vitals on any ordinary Tuesday, and she began giving orders of her own, low and even, telling the gunmen exactly what she needed to keep their friend alive. One of them shoved a rifle into her hands moments later, some twisted test of trust or maybe just panic, daring her to use it or lose everything. The room froze. The staff who had mocked her for a year watched in disbelief as the quiet nurse held that weapon like it was an old, familiar friend, her stance perfect, her eyes sharp, calculating distance and angle the way a surgeon calculates an incision. She never fired a shot. She didn't need to. She used the seconds that weapon bought her to talk the wounded man's condition down to something manageable, to buy time for the negotiators. She quietly signaled a passing security guard to call, and to keep every terrified patient in that room breathing a little easier simply by refusing to let her own fear show. When the first responding officers finally arrived, they found the situation already halfway defused, the gunmen disarmed and cooperating, because Elena Cross had spent 6 years learning exactly how to survive impossible moments and had never once stopped being that person, no matter how many scrubs she wore over the soldier underneath. What happened next was the part nobody in that hospital would ever forget. Word had already reached the base an hour away, because one of the wounded men outside turned out to be connected to a threat the military had been quietly tracking. A convoy arrived not long after the police did, and stepping out of the lead vehicle was a Marine Corps general, silver-haired and stern, flanked by armed personnel whose presence alone seemed to still the air in the room. He walked straight past Dr. Whitfield, straight past the administrators already scrambling to take credit for a crisis they had cowered from, and he stopped in front of Elena, who stood there in blood-streaked scrubs, exhausted, unreadable. He raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute, and he said the words that would echo through that hospital for years to come, "Staff Sergeant, ma'am, it's an honor." Behind him, one by one, the Marines who had entered with him snapped to attention and saluted as well, a wall of disciplined respect aimed entirely at the woman everyone else had dismissed as strange and cold. The emergency room, full of doctors and nurses who had spent a year underestimating her, went utterly silent. Dr. Whitfield's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The nurses who had whispered behind her back stood frozen, some of them beginning to cry, finally understanding exactly who had been standing beside them all along. Elena did not smile, not really, not the kind of smile people expect in movies. She simply returned the salute, quiet and steady, the way she had done 1,000 times before in places far from fluorescent lights and vending machines. In that gesture was everything she had never been able to say out loud, every ounce of grief for Danny Ruiz, every sleepless night, every year of feeling invisible in a room full of people who never thought to ask why the quiet nurse always stood like a soldier. In the weeks that followed, things changed slowly, the way real change usually does. Dr. Whitfield apologized to her privately, awkward and sincere, admitting he'd let his own assumptions blind him to who she really was. The nurses who had mocked her began sitting with her at lunch, not out of pity, but because they finally wanted to know her. Elena didn't need the apologies. What she needed, and what she finally found, was a place where the silence she carried wasn't mistaken for weakness anymore, but understood for what it always had been, the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who had already faced the worst the world could offer, and chosen, every single day since, to keep saving people anyway. Before we go, if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that the quiet ones are often carrying the heaviest weight, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And before you leave, I want you to comment one word below, just one word, that describes how this story made you feel. I read every single one, and tonight, I want to hear from you. Elena Cross never wore her medals again after that night. She didn't need to. Everyone who worked beside her already knew exactly who she was, and more importantly, so did she. If this story moved you even a little, subscribe to Midnight Tales, because there are so many more quiet heroes out there whose stories deserve to be told, and we are just getting started.